Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Whisper. I'm so glad you're here with me. I know many of you use this series to unwind, drift off, or find some peace in the quiet hours. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, take a deep breath in, and out. Tonight's case begins in the quiet English town of Soham on a warm August day in 2002. It started with something so ordinary to best friends, summer freedom, and a visit to the corner shop, but it would become one of the most heartbreaking and widely followed cases in modern British history. Case 1. The disappearance of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. Rephrased script. It was Sunday, August 4th, 2002. 10-year-old Jessica Chapman had just returned from a family vacation. She couldn't wait to see her best friend, Holly Wells, and give her a small gift she'd brought back. The two girls lived only a few doors apart in Soham, Cambridgeshire, and had been inseparable since they were toddlers, born just a month apart and practically growing up side by side. The day before, Holly had gone shopping with her mother and a friend named Natalie. It was a memorable day. Her mom had bought her some new flared trousers, and even her first bra. Natalie had stayed over that night, and when Jessica arrived Sunday morning, the three girls spent a few hours playing computer games before Natalie left around lunchtime. Jessica asked her parents, Sharon and Leslie, if she could stay for lunch. She was having so much fun, and they said yes. Later she called again. Could she stay for dinner too? Her mom agreed and told her to ring again when she was ready to come home. That afternoon, Holly's parents, Nicola and Kevin Wells, were hosting a small barbecue with friends. It was a lovely summer day. Around 3:15 p.m., guests began to arrive. Holly changed into her brand new Manchester United football shirt, which had Beckham printed on the back, just like Jessica's. Nicola snapped a photo of the two girls smiling in their matching outfits at 5:04 p.m. No one knew then that it would become the last known photo of them alive, an image that would soon appear in every newspaper across the UK and beyond. Sometime after dinner, around 6:15 p.m., Holly and Jessica slipped out of the house. They didn't tell anyone, most likely because the shop they wanted to visit was just around the corner, a short walk to the nearby sports center shop. They probably assumed they'd be back in just a few minutes. Back at the Wells house, the barbecue continued. At 8:20 p.m., guests started saying their goodbyes. Nicola called up to the girls to come down and say farewell, but got no response. She went upstairs to Holly's room. It was emptied at first. She wasn't overly concerned. The girls were responsible, polite, and always followed the rules. Their curfew was 8:30 p.m., so she expected them any minute. But by 8:45 p.m., panic began to set in. Nicola rang Jessica's mother, Sharon. The girls weren't there. Kevin and some friends immediately began searching the surrounding area. When nothing turned up, police were contacted at 9:56 p.m. Within hours, a large-scale search was underway, one of the biggest missing persons operations in British history. Volunteers and officers scoured Soham and the surrounding countryside. The girls had vanished without a trace. Police began reconstructing the girls' last movements using CCTV footage and witness statements. Cameras at the local sports center captured the girls entering the shop, smiling and arm in arm. Witnesses said they looked happy, chatting and skipping along, easily recognizable in their identical football shirts. One person even remembered them as the two Beckhams. Another man remembered speaking with them, a school caretaker named Ian Huntley. Ian, originally from Grimsby, had lived in Soham for about a year. He told police the girls had stopped outside his house to ask about his girlfriend, Maxine Carr. As the investigation into Holly and Jessica's disappearance intensified, police decided to bring in Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr for questioning on August 16th. They were both interviewed for 7 hours. At that point, there wasn't enough evidence to hold them, so they were released. But the very next day, a breakthrough. On August 17, 2002, police made a chilling discovery inside a bin on the grounds of the Soham Village College. Investigators found 2 charred Manchester United football shirts, the same ones Holly and Jessica had been wearing the day they vanished. Alongside the shirts were their shoes and undergarments. The items had been partially burned, and the discovery changed the nature of the case. It was no longer just a missing persons investigation. Police now believed they were dealing with a double homicide that same day. The worst fears of everyone involved were confirmed. The bodies of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman were discovered in a ditch near RAF Lakenheath, a U.S. Air Force base in Suffolk, around 30 minutes from Soham. Their remains were severely decomposed and had been burned. Attention quickly returned to Ian and Maxine. Their home was searched, and while the house appeared clean, it was too clean. Everything had been washed. Bedsheets, curtains, even hard-to-reach areas showed signs of recent deep cleaning. A crack was found in the bathtub and a ceiling. Light had been ripped from its fitting in the dining room. Something terrible had clearly happened, but there was little physical evidence left behind. The only fingerprint in the house was Holly's, on a box of chocolates she had given Maxine as a thank you gift at the end of the school year. Investigators learned that Ian Huntley was familiar with the area where the girls' bodies were found. He often visited Lakenheath to watch planes. More suspiciously, the day after the girls vanished, he replaced all 4 tires on his red Ford Fiesta. Police examined the car, and eventually, forensic testing revealed critical fibers and hairs linked to the girls. Although the advanced state of decomposition made it impossible to definitively determine the cause of death, it was believed that Holly and Jessica had been either strangled or suffocated. Investigators also could not confirm whether the girls had been sexually assaulted. Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr were arrested. Maxine was charged with perverting the course of justice for providing Ian with a false alibi. She later claimed she had lied for him because she didn't believe he could be capable of anything so horrific. At trial, the prosecution laid out their theory. Huntley had been home alone the evening the girls disappeared. They believed he saw the girls passing by, lured them inside under false pretenses, and killed them shortly after. One key piece of evidence was Jessica Chapman's mobile phone. Records showed it was still active at 6:34 p.m., meaning the girls were likely still alive in his house at that time. But 12 minutes later, the phone was powered off. And notably, the signal wasn't picked up at the Soham Tower, but by a tower in Burwell, a sign the phone had been moved. Eventually, Huntley admitted the girls had entered his house. He claimed that Holly had a nosebleed, and he let them in so she could clean up. While in the bathroom, he said she accidentally fell into a bathtub that had a few inches of water and drowned. Jessica screamed, and, according to Huntley, he covered her mouth to calm her down, accidentally smothering her to death. The prosecution wasn't buying it. They argued the bath accident scenario was implausible. They said if Holly had drowned, it was because he held her head under the water, and Jessica, a healthy and active 10-year-old, wouldn't have died from a simple hand over her mouth. She would have fought back, tried to escape. The more likely scenario was that she had been forcibly restrained, despite Huntley's efforts to clean up. Investigators did find critical evidence. His fingerprint was discovered on the trash bin liner where the girls' burned clothes were found. His hair was found on their clothing, and the fibers from their shirts were detected in his home and even on his boots. A white chalky substance found on the undercarriage of his car matched the terrain near the ditch where their bodies were discovered. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Ian Huntley was found guilty of both murders. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 40 years. Maxine Carr was convicted of perverting the course of justice. She was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. After serving her time, she was released with a new identity. Case 2. April Jones, rephrased intro. October 1st, 2012, began like any other Monday for the Jones family in the quiet town of Machinet, Wales. Paul and Coral Jones were up early, getting their children, Jasmine, Harley, and 5-year-old April, ready for the school day. The routine was familiar, comforting. That afternoon, April went to her weekly swimming lesson at the local leisure center. She returned home smiling, full of energy. Her friend had come over after swimming, and the girls sat down 2 plates of spaghetti and toast prepared by Paul. Afterwards, they went outside to play on their bikes, a simple, innocent joy for April, who absolutely loved riding. April had been born prematurely, just 7 weeks early, and had mild cerebral palsy that affected her hip and leg, but her bicycle gave her a sense of freedom. She'd learned to ride when she was just 3.5. Her bike was more than just a toy. It was her way of keeping up with her older siblings and her friends. That night, April asked if she could stay out just a little longer. Coral and Paul were hesitant. They didn't usually let her play outside after dark, but it had been a good day. April had just received a glowing report at her parent-teacher meeting. They agreed to give her 15 more minutes. It was just after 7 p.m. The evening was mild and bright, with children still playing in the neighborhood. Their estate in Machinleth was safe, close-knit, and full of familiar faces. No one could have imagined the horror that was about to unfold. Exactly 15 minutes later, Coral asked her son Harley to go bring April home. Moments later, Harley came running back into the house, panicked, breathless, screaming. She's been taken. April's friend had seen it happen. A man had pulled up in a car. April walked over. She got in willingly, it seemed. The car door shut, and the vehicle drove away. Coral called the police, her voice barely audible. She could hardly speak. The words, her daughter had been abducted. The town mobilized within minutes. Police, neighbors, volunteers, everyone was out searching. But this was not a simple case of a missing child. It quickly became clear something much more sinister was at play. Case 2. The abduction and murder of April Jones, rephrased script in the town of Machinleth. Nestled in the quiet Welsh countryside, people believed they knew their neighbors. It was the kind of place where families waved to each other on school runs. Children played freely on the street, and danger felt distant. So when 46-year-old Mark Bridger moved into a cottage nearby, no one suspected a thing. He told locals he was ex-SAS, a former Special Forces soldier. He claimed to have military experience, survival skills, and a clean slate. He came across as charismatic, maybe even impressive. He worked at a local slaughterhouse and had 6 children from 4 different women. Though he lived alone, he seemed like just another member of the community. But it was all a lie. Mark Bridger was not who he pretended to be. Behind closed doors, he harbored dark secrets and a twisted double life. The stories about the army were fiction. He was a fantasist, a manipulator, and, as police would soon discover, a violent predator with a deeply disturbing past. He had a long criminal history, including convictions for assault, theft, and firearm offenses. And while that hinted at his volatility, it didn't yet explain how he was connected to the disappearance of a 5-year-old girl. That little girl was April Jones. She vanished on the night of October 1st, 2012, after being allowed to stay out just 15 extra minutes as a reward for a good school report. Her parents, Coral and Paul Jones, thought it was harmless, a small act of trust in a town where nothing like this had ever happened. But at 7:30 p.m., April's friend saw her get into a vehicle, a left-hand drive car, something rare in their area. The friend said April appeared happy, not afraid. Within minutes, she was gone. The next day, police arrested Mark Bridger. He quickly admitted that April had been in his car, but claimed he had accidentally hit her while driving, and panicked, putting her in the vehicle to take her to the hospital. He insisted he couldn't remember what happened next, blaming memory loss from excessive drinking. It wasn't convincing, in fact. It was far from the truth. Bridger was known to consume up to 25 cans of cider a day at that time, but his story didn't match the evidence, nor did it explain why April hadn't been taken to any hospital, or why her body was nowhere to be found. The day April disappeared had already been emotional for him. His girlfriend had broken up with him, and he told his boss he wouldn't be coming into work. He then attended the very same parent-teacher meeting that April's parents went to. One of his children went to the same school. What police soon uncovered was far more disturbing. That same day, before April vanished, Bridger had spent time at his cottage on his laptop. His internet activity revealed his obsession. He had been viewing indecent images of young girls, including photos of a friend's 14-year-old daughter, and reaching out to several women online, asking them out for drinks. On his way home, he stopped his car and spoke to two schoolgirls, ages 8 and 10, inviting one to a sleepover. It was shortly after this encounter that he spotted April playing outside with her friend's CCTV. Footage showed his car leaving the estate around 7:30 p.m., heading toward his home and seen by 8:30 p.m. A witness saw him pulling into his driveway. That left a 1-hour window unaccounted for. Over the following days, a massive search effort began, the largest missing person search in UK history. Thousands of volunteers joined, police in scouring rivers, woods, and fields around Machinlith. But still, there was no sign of April. Eventually, attention turned to Bridger's cottage. What investigators found inside chilled them to the bone. Though the home had been thoroughly cleaned, a forensic team found April's blood in several locations. Near the fireplace, in the bathroom, and by the washing machine. Bone fragments, including pieces of a child's skull, were discovered in the fireplace itself. The burns on those remains were consistent with high temperature incineration, suggesting that April's body had been partially destroyed in the home's wood burner. Specialist knives were found in the home, and police were now confident Mark Bridger had murdered April Jones. The horrifying truth was becoming clearer. Police believed Bridger sexually assaulted and murdered April, then attempted to dispose of her body in a way that ensured she would never be found. 3 witnesses reported seeing him with a black bin bag the morning after April went missing. He was also seen near the river that same day. Tragically, April's full body was never recovered. Only 17 fragments of her remains, tiny pieces of bone, were ever found. When investigators searched Bridger's computer, they found more than 300 disturbing images of child sexual abuse. On the very day April disappeared, he had searched for information about the Soham murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, as well as the rape and murder of schoolgirl Caroline Dickinson. The motive was undeniable. Bridger was charged with abduction, murder, and perverting the course of justice. In court, he maintained his story that April's death had been an accident. He even tried to discredit April's friend, saying she lied about seeing April get into his car willingly. The jury didn't believe him. There were no signs of a crash on April's bike or Bridger's vehicle. There was no medical evidence to support his account. And perhaps most disturbingly, throughout the trial, Bridger referred to April as Little April, a term that haunted her family, especially considering Bridger was a towering He was found guilty on all counts. It took the jury just over 4 hours to reach their verdict. At sentencing, Mr. Justice Griffith Williams delivered a powerful statement. He told Bridger, "There is no doubt in my mind that you are a pedophile who has for some time harbored sexual and morbid fantasies about young girls, storing on your laptop not only images of prepubescent and pubescent girls, but foul pornography of the gross sexual abuse of children." Mark Bridger was sentenced to life in prison with a whole life tariff. He will never be released. In the years that followed, April's family and community worked to reclaim what had been taken from them. Bridger's cottage, the place where Her life was stolen, was demolished. In its place now stands a memorial garden, a quiet space of remembrance, a space for healing. The love for April Jones lives on. Her name is spoken not just in Machynlleth, but across the UK, a reminder of innocence lost, and of the unbreakable bond between a community and its children. Case 3. The disappearance and murder of Denise Huber. Rephrased script. It was June 3, 1991, a warm summer night in California, when 23-year-old Denise Huber headed out for what should have been just another fun evening. She was on her way to a Morrissey concert in Englewood, California. Denise had a bright personality and a full life ahead of her. She lived with her parents, Dennis and Ione Huber, and her brother Jeff, in Newport Beach. Denise worked as a waitress at the spaghetti factory, a job she loved. Her life was filled with family, friends, and laughter. She was especially close with her parents. Every Friday morning, she and her dad would go out for breakfast, a weekly ritual they both cherished. Just days before the concert, Denise had left her father a sweet note on his computer. "Hi Dad, I love you. Have a great day. Love." Denise smiley face. That was the kind of girl Denise was. Warm, thoughtful, and always full of kindness. Originally, Denise was supposed to go to the concert with her boyfriend Steven, but at the last minute, he had to work, so she asked a friend, Robert Calvert, to go with her instead. Denise picked him up from his place in Huntington Beach around 8 p.m. On the way, they stopped to buy some vodka, took a few shots, and headed to the show. Nothing wild, just enough to get into the concert spirit. After the concert ended, around 11:30 p.m., they decided to stop at a nearby bar in Long Beach for one last drink. They stayed until closing time, sometime between 1:30 and 2 a.m., and then called it a night. Robert later recalled that Denise dropped him off around 2:05 a.m. Denise then began the drive home alone, taking the 73 toll road a stretch she knew well. But just a few minutes from home, her car blew a tire. It was a well-lit area, and there were call boxes and a gas station nearby. Help should have been easy to find, but no one ever heard from Denise again. When her parents woke up and realized she hadn't come home, they were immediately worried. It was completely unlike Denise to disappear without a word. They called her friends, but no one had heard from her. Later that day, a friend named Tammy Brown drove down the freeway Denise would have taken. Around 10 p.m., she spotted Denise's Honda Civic abandoned on the side of the road. The back passenger side tire was flat. The car was unlocked. The hazard lights were still blinking, but Denise was gone. There were no keys, no purse, and no sign of struggle. It was as if she had simply stepped out of the car and vanished. For days, weeks, and then months, her family searched. Posters, billboards, and TV appeals filled the area. Friends, volunteers, and total strangers joined in the search. But there were no clues, no leads, no trace. The case grew cold. Then, 3 years later, a break. It was July 13th, 1994, in Prescott, Arizona, over 400 miles away. A woman named Elaine Court had recently met a man named John Familaro, a local house painter, at a flea market. He told her he sold paint from his home and invited her to stop by if she ever needed more. Elaine decided to take him up on the offer. When she arrived at his property, she noticed something strange. A Ryder-moving truck was parked outside, one that looked out of place for the neighborhood. As she waited for John to come out, she became suspicious. Something about the truck and John's odd behavior made her uneasy, so after she left, she contacted authorities. When police searched the Ryder truck, they were horrified by what they found inside. Inside the freezer compartment of the truck, carefully sealed and locked, was the frozen body of Denise Huber. She had been missing for over 3 years, still wearing the black dress, jacket, and stockings from the night of the concert. Denise had been bound and gagged, and had suffered a fatal blow to the head. Police quickly arrested John Familaro, and soon, more disturbing details emerged. He was originally from Southern California, the very area where Denise disappeared. He had no criminal record, but neighbors and acquaintances described him as intense, awkward, and sometimes aggressive. Inside his Arizona home, investigators found even more damning evidence. Journals filled with violent fantasies, bondage tools, hundreds of photos of women, and trophies from other women he had stalked. He even kept newspaper clippings about Denise's disappearance. It was clear this was not a crime of opportunity. It was premeditated, calculated. Chilling prosecutors later determined that Famularo had come across Denise on the 73 freeway the night her car broke down. He likely posed as someone offering help and then abducted her. He took her to his home in Laguna Hills, where she was murdered. After killing her, he placed her body in a freezer, transported it to Arizona, and tried to start a new life, hiding his secret behind a garage door and a padlocked truck. In 1997, John Famularo was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He remains on death row in San Quentin. For Denise's family, the discovery brought closure, but not peace. The pain of losing Denise in such a brutal, senseless way was something they would carry forever, but they've chosen to honor her memory by living the way she did, with kindness, compassion, and courage. In her name, they've spoken out about violence against women, and they've continued to remind the world of who Denise Huber really was. Not just a victim, but a daughter, a sister, and a bright young woman whose light was stolen far too soon. Case 3, Part 2. The secret behind the freezer. The murder of Denise Huber. As a child, John Famularo grew up in a home dominated by a strict and overbearing mother. She ruled with fear, using religion to control her children, often warning them they'd go to hell if they disobeyed. She monitored their phone calls, followed them if they left the house, and even insisted on washing their bodies herself, focusing obsessively on what she called their special areas. The environment was repressive, and John began developing rituals to cope. If someone touched him on his left side, he had to touch his right to balance it out. His neck and head twitched constantly. Still, those who knew John described him as intelligent, quiet, even polite, though always a bit secretive. No one could have imagined just how dark that secrecy ran. By the time he was living in Prescott, Arizona, John had become a textbook hoarder, like his mother. But unlike the chaos often associated with hoarding, John's was orderly. Everything was boxed, labeled, and neatly stacked. His 3-bedroom house was filled with possessions, and right behind it, his mother lived in a small home just beyond his backyard. On July 13, 1994, Elaine Court pulled into John's driveway. She had met him briefly at a local flea market where he sold paint supplies, and now she was stopping by to buy more. But something felt off. A large Ryder rental truck was parked beside the house, and for reasons she couldn't explain, it made her skin crawl. The scene was so unnerving that Elaine jotted down the license plate before she left, a decision that would prove pivotal. Later that day, unable to shake the unease, she contacted police. When officers ran the plate, they discovered the truck had been reported stolen 6 months earlier in Orange County, California. Officers also noticed a long orange extension cord running from John's home into the truck. The truck was padlocked, but when they forced it open, they found cans of paint stacked inside. But that wasn't what the cord powered. The cord ran to a large industrial freezer in the back of the truck. Suspecting it might be used to store drugs, officers called in narcotics. But when they opened the freezer, it wasn't narcotics they found. Inside was the frozen, naked body of a young woman, curled into a semi-fetal position, her hands handcuffed tightly behind her back. Her head was wrapped in 3 layers of white plastic bags, her mouth sealed with duct tape that stretched from her eyelids down to her chin. Her skull was badly shattered, and pieces of plastic were embedded in her head from the force of the impact. Police thawed the body carefully, using a hairdryer to preserve as much forensic evidence as possible. It was Denise Huber. Fingerprints confirmed the heartbreaking discovery. She had been missing for 3 years. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, at least 31 separate blows to the skull, inflicted by a nail puller. Her injuries were so severe that her skull had shattered into fragments. The medical examiner also concluded Denise had been sexually assaulted. The discovery confirmed what police had feared. Denise hadn't just disappeared. She had been brutally murdered. John Familaro immediately became the prime suspect, and thanks to his obsessive hoarding, investigators didn't have to look far for damning evidence. Inside John's home, police found a box labeled Christmas. Inside were Denise's heels damaged and scuffed. One heel was broken, and her friends later confirmed Denise would never have gone out wearing damaged shoes. These had clearly been worn after she was abducted. In the same house, police found the murder weapons: a blood-stained hammer, the nail puller, duct tape, and the handcuff key. They also discovered Denise's clothing, her personal belongings, and even John's clothing from the night she vanished, all boxed and preserved, as if trophies from a kill. There was more. Among his collection, police found newspaper clippings about Denise's disappearance. He had even recorded a televised appeal Denise's parents made, begging the public for information. The very people suffering from his violence were now part of his perverse personal archive. Investigators now had to figure out how Denise ended up in John's freezer, and why. In 1991, John had been living in a warehouse in Laguna Hills, California, where he ran a painting business. Police located the warehouse, which had since been rented to new tenants. The walls had been painted over, but when officers removed a section of drywall, they found bloodstains that were matched to Denise's DNA. They were confident that this was the site of her murder, piecing together the night of June 3rd. Investigators believe that after Denise's car blew a tire, she got out to look for help. She may have begun walking along the shoulder of the 73 freeway when John spotted her. Instead of helping her, he kidnapped her, possibly luring her into his car under the guise of offering assistance. The state of Denise's shoes supported this theory. The heels were heavily damaged, far more than if she had simply walked down an embankment, as the defense would later argue. One investigator even recreated the walk in similar shoes, and confirmed that Denise's showed far more damage. Damage that only made sense if she had been dragged or forced over rough terrain. Back at his warehouse, John handcuffed Denise, wrapped her head in duct tape, placed plastic bags over her face, sexually assaulted her, and then bludgeoned her, at least 31 times. Her murder was sadistic, prolonged, and intentional. Just days after Denise's disappearance, John purchased the freezer her body was eventually found in, and kept the receipt. In 1994, 3 years later, that same freezer was still in use, plugged into his house via an extension cord, and sitting in the back of a stolen truck, right in his driveway. He had hidden her in plain sight. John Familaro was charged with first-degree murder, and 2 special circumstances: that the murder occurred during a kidnapping, and that it occurred during the commission of sodomy. The case for first-degree murder was overwhelming, but the kidnapping and sodomy charges, while strongly suspected, relied more heavily on circumstantial evidence. Denise's body had been frozen, making DNA evidence difficult to retrieve, and John's defense team tried to argue there was no physical evidence of a struggle at the scene, but the jury didn't buy it. They deliberated and found John guilty on all counts. The special circumstances, kidnapping and sodomy, were both upheld. During the penalty phase, even more disturbing facts about John's past would emerge. Case 4. The disappearance of Cherish Periwinkle. It was June 21st, 2013, and 8-year-old Cherish Periwinkle was preparing for something special, her summer trip to California to visit her father. She lived in Jacksonville, Florida, with her mother Rain, her mother's boyfriend, and her 2 younger sisters. The next morning, she was due to board a flight. So this day was meant for last-minute packing, washing her hair, and picking out a few new clothes for the trip. That evening, around 7:30 p.m., Rain walked with her daughters to a nearby Dollar General on Edgewood Avenue. They didn't own a car, so they made the 20-minute walk with a stroller in tow, with just $100 to stretch between clothes, household items, and airport expenses. Rain knew their options were limited. Inside the store, Rain browsed the children's clothing section, picking out a sweet white dress with red hearts for Cherish. But after checking prices at the register, she realized they simply couldn't afford it. She put the dress back. What Rain didn't realize was that a man had been watching them closely. That man approached her outside the store. He introduced himself as Don and claimed he was waiting for his wife. He said they had a $150 Walmart gift card they weren't going to use, and offered it to Rain so she could buy clothes for the girls. A cashier would later confirm that he saw them talking in the parking lot for about 15 to 20 minutes. Don seemed calm, even friendly. He told Rain his wife was taking a while and suggested they meet her directly at Walmart instead. As the rain began to fall, Rain hesitated walk home in the rain or accept a ride to Walmart with her 3 daughters. Against her instincts, she accepted the ride. Don's van was white, with carpeted interior and covered windows. He drove them the short distance to Walmart, continuing the story that they'd meet his wife there, but there was no wife. Inside Walmart, Rain stayed near the children's section with her girls, while Don hovered. His behavior quickly turned strange. He wasn't shopping for anything of his own, except for one disturbing item, a bundle of rope, which he placed in the cart. He also showed unusual attention to Cherish. At one point, he picked out women's high-heeled shoes entirely, inappropriate for an 8-year-old, and encouraged her to try them on. Even more concerning, he took Cherish into the changing room alone, twice. By the time Walmart was preparing to close, Rain and her girls still hadn't eaten. Don offered to get them food from the McDonald's inside the store. Cherish went with him to grab cheeseburgers. It was a decision Rain would never forgive herself, for she assumed they were just heading to the in-store McDonald's. But 20 minutes passed, then 30, and suddenly, Walmart was closing. Don hadn't returned. There was no food, no gift card, and most terrifying of all, no sign of Cherish. Rain searched every aisle, the McDonald's counter, the parking lot, nothing. At 11:20 p.m., she called 911. The only information she could give police was that Don was an older white man, drove a white van, and had a chilling energy she couldn't shake. Police, however, did recognize him immediately. He was Donald James Smith, a 61-year-old convicted sex offender with a history of crimes against children dating back to the 1970s. And worse, he had only been released from prison 3 weeks earlier. Authorities began a frantic search through the night. Then, around 9 a.m. the next morning, during an unrelated roadside investigation, an officer spotted the white van driving by. Smith was arrested on the spot, but Cherish was not in the van. The vehicle had been emptied. The stroller and shopping bags Rain had brought were gone. One detail alarmed investigators immediately. Smith's pants were soaking wet from the waist down. Even though the rest of his clothes were dry, it wasn't hard to guess what that might mean. A tip soon led police to a wooded area near a creek. Behind a church, a canine unit was deployed. There, under a tree in the shallow water, they found Cherish. Her body had been weighted down with bricks and debris. The brutality inflicted on her was horrific. She had been gagged so tightly her gums bled, sexually assaulted, and sodomed. The full extent of her injuries painted a chilling picture of premeditated cruelty. Donald Smith had lured her away under the pretense of kindness. He had used deception, calculated patience, and the trust of a desperate mother, just trying to provide for her daughters. His intentions were monstrous from the beginning. The murder of Cherish. Periwinkle was a crime that devastated not only her family, but also a community that had watched the tragedy unfold in real time. It also raised urgent questions about how A man like Donald Smith, a repeat offender with a known record of targeting children, was free in the first place. The case would go on to become one of the most emotionally charged child murder trials in Florida's history. But no verdict, no sentence, could undo what was done. Case 6, the beheading of Lise Dodd. It was June 9, 2022, when the quiet community of Alton, Illinois, was rocked by a crime so gruesome, it felt almost unimaginable. Lise Dodd, a 22-year-old woman who was 8 months pregnant, had stopped responding to messages. Her mother, growing increasingly anxious, decided to check on her daughter's apartment. Nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to find on site. Lise's home was a scene of unthinkable violence. Lise had been decapitated. Her severed head was later discovered inside a dumpster located at the same apartment complex. Police were called to the scene immediately, and what followed would unravel one of the most brutal domestic murder cases in recent Illinois history. The suspect was quickly identified as Doindrea S. Holloway, a 25-year-old man from Litchfield. Holloway had already been arrested that same day in Gillespie, Illinois, on an unrelated bicycle theft charge. When Gillespie officers ran his details and matched him to the murder investigation in Alton, the horrific connection was made. Holloway and Lise had been in an on-again, off-again relationship for roughly 2 years. According to Lise's mother, their relationship had been marked by troubling signs of emotional abuse, volatility, and control. And while Holloway was not the father of Lise's unborn baby, he had remained intermittently involved in her life. Lisa's mother had voiced her concerns to Holloway in the past. She'd spoken to him directly about the way he treated her daughter and tried to encourage him to either commit to healthy change or stay away. But nothing could have hinted at what he was truly capable of. Throughout the investigation and the early phases of the trial, a disturbing picture of Holloway emerged. He showed no remorse. In fact, during court appearances, Holloway was described as erratic, uncooperative, and defiant. At one point, he was forcibly removed from court for violent outbursts, including banging his head against the table and speaking incoherently. Psychologists were brought in to determine if he was mentally competent to stand trial. Despite those behaviors, the prosecutor's office pressed forward, outlining the sheer brutality of the crime. Lise hadn't just been murdered, she had been systematically mutilated. Her death was declared a crime of extreme violence and savagery. Lise had been eagerly anticipating the birth of her daughter. She had even picked out a name. She was setting up a nursery and planning a baby shower. She had dreams and goals, many centered around being a mother. But her life and that of her unborn baby was violently taken from her by someone she once trusted. The murder of Lise Dodd was not just an attack on one woman, but on two lives, hers and the child she was. Just weeks away from bringing into the world, Holloway was eventually charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple additional felony charges, including intentional homicide of an unborn child, dismemberment of a human body, and concealment of a homicidal death. The community of Alton, and indeed the entire state, mourned for Lise. Her family remembered her as bright, joyful, and kind. Her mother has since become a voice for domestic violence awareness, speaking about the importance of recognizing red flags, trusting instincts, and protecting vulnerable individuals, especially pregnant women in volatile relationships. This case, much like so many others, is a reminder of the hidden violence that can exist behind closed doors. What may look like a tumultuous relationship from the outside can sometimes conceal a ticking time bomb of unchecked rage. And in the case of Lise Dodd, it ended in unimaginable tragedy, one that no family should ever have to face. Case 6. The murder of Lise Dodd and her unborn child. By the time January 17, 2025 arrived, justice had finally been delivered in one of the most horrifying murder cases Illinois has ever seen. D'Andreassi, age 25, had pleaded guilty to 3 charges: first-degree murder, homicide of an unborn child, and concealment and dismemberment of a human body. for those crimes. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. The victim was Lise Dodd, 22 years old and 8 months pregnant. She had been decapitated in her apartment in Alton, Illinois, and her severed head was later discovered in a dumpster near the building. The crime scene shocked even seasoned officers. During sentencing, State's Attorney Tom Haynes stated, "For the family and loved ones of Lise, these types of issues have caused continued angst and uncertainty. The guilty conviction ends that. Our hope is that this conviction and sentence provide the family and loved ones some assurance and will be a step towards healing." Following the verdict, Holloway was transferred to Menard Correctional Center near Chester, Illinois, where he remains in custody. Throughout the case, Holloway's deteriorating mental health came into focus. He claimed to hear one he named Ruth that instructed him to commit acts of violence. At one point he was evaluated for competency to stand trial, but was ultimately found fit to face justice. Many observers believe Holloway's case is a chilling example of untreated mental illness spiraling into darkness, but others suggest a more spiritual element, that evil, in its most raw and demonic form, had found a host. Whether you frame it as psychosis or possession, what's indisputable is this: 2 lives were ended, and a family was shattered forever. Case 7. The Coleman Family Murders on May 5, 2009. In the quiet suburb of Columbia, Illinois, a seemingly perfect family was ripped apart not by a stranger, but from within. Chris Coleman, a former Marine turned security officer for the Joyce Meyer Ministries, murdered his wife Sherry and their 2 young sons, Gavin 9 and Garrett 11, strangling them all in their beds before heading out for an early morning workout. Chris and Sherry had been married for 10 years. Outwardly, they seemed like the image of a happy family, faithful, successful, and well-liked in their community. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Sherry had begun suspecting that Chris was having an affair, and she was right. He had been carrying on a relationship with another woman, someone Sherry had once called a friend. Around the same time, Chris began receiving anonymous threatening letters, messages that warned him to quit working for the ministry or suffer consequences. But investigators would later find out those letters had been written by Chris himself, as part of an elaborate plan to cover up the premeditated murder of his own family. The morning of the murders, Chris called a police officer neighbor, saying he couldn't reach his family and felt something was wrong. Officers responded, entered the home through an open window, and found a gruesome crime scene. The walls had been spray-painted with cryptic threats, and all 3 victims were discovered strangled in their beds. Chris was arrested on May 19, 2009, and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. During the investigation and trial, prosecutors laid out the real motive. Chris wanted a new life with his mistress, but divorce would risk his job, his reputation, and custody of his children. So instead, he chose murder. The trial lasted 9 days. The jury took just hours to deliver a verdict, guilty on all counts. Chris Coleman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was initially sent to Pontiac Prison, but due to safety concerns, was later transferred to Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. In a heartbreaking legal battle that followed, Chris's parents fought to keep the remains of Gavin and Garrett buried near Chris, but the court ruled against it. The children's bodies were relocated near Sherry's family in Chicago, and Chris lost all rights to decide where his victims should rest to this day. Chris Coleman insists he's innocent and has filed several appeals. Some say this was a case of unchecked narcissism. Others believe it was the influence of something much darker. In letters, phone records, and journal entries, we see a man who carefully planned out his deception, a man who, instead of resisting temptation, fed it until it devoured everything he once claimed to love. Case 8. The Rockford Massacre. The spree of Christian sadtoids started like any other day on Home Street in Rockford, Illinois, a quiet, suburban neighborhood where violence was the last thing anyone expected. But by the time police caught up with Christian Sato, the area had been turned into a war zone. 4 people were dead, 7 others were injured, and the trail of terror stretched block after block. According to investigators, the horror began inside the home of Jacob Schutbach, age 23. Sato and Schutbach were friends, and that day they had reportedly smoked marijuana together. But something changed. Something snapped, in what can only be described as a sudden, savage explosion of violence. Sato grabbed a kitchen knife and fatally stabbed Jacob and Jacob's 63-year-old mother, Ramona Schutbach. Witnesses say Jacob tried to escape into the street, but Sato chased him down, stabbed him again, and then ran him over with his truck. Jacob somehow made it back to the house before collapsing and dying, but Sato didn't stop there. Moments later, he encountered Jay Larson, a 49-year-old mail carrier on Weta Drive. Witnesses watched in horror as Sato struck Larson with his vehicle, beat him, and then returned to his truck to grab another knife. Larson would not survive the attack. The next location was a home in the 4800 block of Cleveland Avenue, where Sato broke in and stabbed 3 people. Thankfully, all 3 survived, thanks in part to a brutal counterattack. They fought him off with a bottle, and their pit bull bit Sato repeatedly during the struggle. But the rampage continued. Sato moved on, breaking into another nearby home, where he attacked 3 young girls with a baseball bat. Jenna Newcomb, just 15 years old, died from her injuries. Still armed and increasingly unhinged, Sato shattered a window on Florence Street and attacked Lindsay Craig. She managed to escape the home and flee down the street, bleeding and screaming. Sato pursued her with a knife in hand. A bystander, Keith Varney, stopped his vehicle to help only to be attacked himself. The neighborhood was now in chaos. Residents were sheltering in place, terrified. Finally, police cornered Sato nearby. A witness recalled hearing officers shouting, "Stop! Get down!" from both sides of a house. Moments later, Sato was led away in bloody handcuffs. President Joe Biden later issued a statement. "We are praying for the families of those who lost loved ones, and hoping that all those injured make a full recovery. We are also grateful for the heroic actions of local law enforcement, who confronted the suspect and prevented the loss of more innocent life." Sato admitted to the attacks. In a chilling statement to investigators, he said the marijuana he smoked that day was laced with something else, a drug that triggered overwhelming paranoia and violence. But his friend Jacob, who had smoked the same substance, didn't become violent. So what happened? Some point to mental illness, others to trauma, or an undiagnosed psychotic break. But there are those who see something darker. Some who study these types of crimes suggest that demonic influence is spiritual or metaphorical might explain acts that seem otherwise senseless. Could this have been an unhinged mind unraveling, or something more spiritual, more sinister, whispering behind the madness? Whatever the answer, what's undeniable is this: an entire community was shattered in a single day, for lives were taken. Others will never be the same. And Christian Sato, once a friend and neighbor, is now remembered as the face of a tragedy Rockford will never forget. Case 9. The Bushwhacker of Missouri. Sam Hildebrand's bloody vow. Long before forensic science or cable news, crime shows, the hills of Missouri were home to a man whose name still echoed with fear decades after his death. Sam Hildebrand, born on January 6, 1836, in St. Francois County, Sam was wild from the start. He attended school for just one day before cursing out the teacher and storming home. His father gave him a choice: go back to school or work the farm. Sam chose the farm, and threatening to send him to school again became the only discipline that ever worked. By 19, he was married to Margaret Hampton, and they had started a family near the old homestead. The Hildebrands had raised free-roaming hogs for years, but when new settlers moved into the area, disputes over livestock turned ugly fistfights, lawsuits, and deep grudges became the norm. Things escalated during the early days of the Civil War. A cousin offered Sam a horse in trade, which Sam later realized had been stolen. The local vigilante committee, a band of self-appointed Union loyalists, accused Sam and his brother of being Confederate sympathizers and thieves. They swore to kill them. One night, desperate and hungry, Sam crept back home only to walk into an ambush. He survived, but that moment would change him forever. The vigilantes later captured and hanged his brother while burning down Sam's house, leaving his wife and 5 children with nothing. Sam vowed revenge. He fled to Arkansas and joined General Jeff Thompson, a Confederate commander who made Sam a major in a guerrilla unit. These units, known as bushwhackers, operated in the shadows, raiding Union outposts and punishing those deemed enemies of the South. But for Sam, it was personal. He returned to Missouri and systematically hunted down the vigilantes who had destroyed his family. He didn't just kill them, he left messages, burned homes, and made sure entire communities knew his name. The war gave him cover, but vengeance became his religion by the time he was shot and killed near Pinckneyville, Illinois, in 1872. Newspapers called him the Desperado and claimed he had finally been stopped. But Sam Hildebrand saw himself not as a criminal but as a wronged man on a righteous mission. Case 9. Sam Hildebrand, the guerrilla who refused to surrender in the shadowed hills of post-Civil War Missouri. Sam Hildebrand became a name etched into local legend, part vigilante, part outlaw, and wholly feared. After Union-backed vigilantes burned down his family's home, murdered 2 of his brothers and his uncle, and drove his mother off her land, Sam made a promise. He would make them pay, and he did. Operating out of St. Francois County, Sam launched a ruthless campaign of revenge and guerrilla warfare. He struck at Union supply trains, raided military camps, and executed the very men he held responsible for destroying his family. Historians estimate he killed between 80 to 100 men, carving notches into his rifle, nicknamed Kill Devil, for every life taken. When the war officially ended, Sam wasn't ready to put down his gun. In his own words, written in his autobiography, he confessed, "I was annoyed beyond all measure by the reflection that the war had suddenly ceased before I was done fighting." But his wife, worn out from years of bloodshed and hardship, finally convinced him to surrender. On May 26, 1865, Sam reluctantly accepted a parole. He tried to return to civilian life, renting farmland in Arkansas and moving away from his past. But the past wasn't ready to let him go. In 1869, he moved back to St. Genevieve County, just across the border from the land he once fought to avenge. His presence unsettled the remaining Union loyalist survivors of his wrath. They contacted the governor and demanded action. A $10,000 bounty was placed on Hildebrand's head, an astronomical amount at the time, and bounty hunters flooded the region. One attempt on his life left him wounded. He barely escaped with his life after a dramatic shootout. The state militia was even mobilized to track him down, but he vanished again, this time traveling across the South with his family. In 1870, he told his life story to a pair of journalists. The result was a controversial autobiography that painted him not as a criminal, but a man seeking justice through blood. When his wife passed away sometime after, in Texas, Hildebrand relocated once more, this time to Pinckneyville, Illinois, with his children. There, he lived in near obscurity, cutting wood to survive, but the fire never left him. In his memoirs, he wrote, "I make no apology to mankind for my acts of retaliation. I make no whining appeal to the world for sympathy. I sought revenge, and I found it." In March of 1872, Hildebrand was arrested in a Pinckneyville saloon for violating a local ordinance. Things quickly escalated when he was taken into custody for assault with intent to kill. During the scuffle, Hildebrand pulled a knife and stabbed Deputy John Ragland in the leg. Ragland responded with a gunshot. One bullet to the head ended The saga of Sam Hildebrand. Sam's only surviving brother identified the body. Deputy Ragland survived, but the injury left him with a lifelong limp. He later moved to California, where he lived out his final days. Despite the massive bounty, Ragland reportedly received only $1,500 for bringing down one of the most hunted men in post-war America. Case 10, Samantha Koenig, abduction in Anchorage, Alaska. February 2012. It began like a regular Thursday shift. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, a bright, spirited barista, was working the late shift at a small roadside coffee kiosk commonplace in Alaska, especially in winter. She was expected home that night. She never made it. By the next morning, panic had set in. Her family knew something was wrong. She hadn't taken any clothes or supplies. And then came the text message. I'm going to a friend's house for a few days. Tell Dad I love him. You won't hear from me until I come home. It sounded off impersonal. Her boyfriend read it in confusion. It wasn't Samantha's style, and none of her friends knew anything. Posters flooded the city, and her father offered a $12,500 reward. Anchorage rallied behind the family. On February 11th, more than 1,000 people gathered in Town Square Park, holding candles, praying, hoping. Miles away, the man who had the answers wasn't concerned. He was on vacation. He'd boarded a cruise ship out of New Orleans, sipping drinks and savoring the headlines about the desperate search. From New Orleans, he stopped in Dallas, then made his way back to Anchorage by February 16th. But boredom crept in again, looking for a distraction. He set fire to a house and barn outside town, the sky filled with smoke, the flames roaring. But he stayed, asking passersby for directions before disappearing into the haze. Back home in Anchorage, on February 19th, his girlfriend was at work, his daughter at school. Alone, he went to his shed and opened a freezer. Inside, wrapped in a tarp, lay the frozen body of Samantha Koenig. She was nude. Blood from a wound in her back had soaked through the insulation lining the bottom of the freezer. Annoyed at the mess, the man cleaned the shed, burning the tarp, insulation, and Samantha's clothing in the fireplace. But he wasn't done. He left her body in the shed, went shopping, and returned with makeup, fishing line, sewing needles, a camera, and a newspaper dated February 13th. His next plan was grotesque. He staged her body to appear alive, sewing her eyelids open, posing her, applying makeup to her thawing skin. He placed the newspaper in her lap, snapped a photograph, and sent it to Samantha's family as proof of life. The killer was Israel Kiza, name that would soon become synonymous with calculated, sadistic evil. Case 10 continued. The final deception. Samantha Koenig. It took hours, makeup, needles, fishing line, but eventually, he had her posed just right. In her lap sat a newspaper dated February 13th, proof at least it would appear that she was still alive. The photo was staged, chillingly convincing to an untrained eye. The man Israel Keys snapped several photos with his new camera, then sat at his computer and began to type. It was a ransom note, cold and calculated. He'd seen the news coverage. He knew Samantha's father had offered $12,500, but Keys wanted more. He demanded $30,000 to be deposited into Samantha's bank account. Laughing to himself, he used Samantha's phone to text her boyfriend. The message contained directions to a local park, where he had stashed the ransom note and the grotesquely fabricated photo of her supposed survival. But Samantha had already been dead for over 2 weeks. Keys wasn't done. On February 21st, he drove out to Matanuska Lake, dragging with him a cooler of dismembered remains. Walking across the frozen surface, he cut a hole in the ice, tied her body parts to fishing weights, and lowered them into the dark, frigid water. Afterward, as if nothing had happened, he fished. By the time he packed up his gear and headed home, he was looking forward to preparing a fish dinner for his family that night. The nightmare was over for him. For now, Case 11. The disappearance of Sherry Smithett was May 31st, 1985. The threshold between spring and summer in Lexington County, South Carolina. 18-year-old Sherry Faye Smith was just days away from graduation. Life was full of excitement, college plans, a trip to the Bahamas, and the honor of singing the national anthem at her commencement ceremony. That morning, she joined her family in prayer, as they did every day, and spent her afternoon rehearsing with her chorus teacher. Later, she stopped by a friend's pool party, then headed home. She never made it to the front door. Sherry pulled up to her family's secluded home on Platte Springs Road, surrounded by fields of tall sun-dried grass. She parked her blue Chevette and walked down the long gravel path to check the mailbox, something she'd done countless times before. That's when he pulled up. A stranger, a man in his 30s, his car a reddish-purple Oldsmobile Cutlass, early 1980s model, came to a stop beside hers. She looked at him in confusion as he said something she couldn't hear over the rumble of both engines. He didn't repeat himself. He simply got out and closed the distance between them, fast. A cold barrel pressed against her skin. "If you want to live," he told her, "get in the car." Raised in a loving, faithful home, Sherry believed in the goodness of people. She likely couldn't have realized that stepping into that car meant she would never come home again. From inside the house, her father, Bob Smith, a well-known Baptist pastor and engineer, glanced out at the driveway. He saw her car running and assumed she had stopped to get the mail. But minutes passed, and it still sat there. Sherry was nowhere in sight. Her mother, Hilda, tried to ease his anxiety. Maybe Sherry had gotten lost in a letter from her older sister Dawn. But the dread kept building. Bob got in his car and drove to the end of the driveway. What he found turned his stomach. Sherry's car was still running. Her shoes were inside. Her purse was open. A handful of letters lay scattered on the ground. There were bare footprints leading away from the car, but none coming back. And worst of all, her life-saving medication was still in her purse. Sherry suffered from a rare condition, diabetes insipidus, sometimes called water diabetes. Without her medicine, and in the blistering southern heat, dehydration could set in quickly. Time was already working against them. Bob rushed inside and called the police. Hilda drove the back roads in a desperate attempt to find her daughter. Within 30 minutes, law enforcement was on the scene. Unlike many jurisdictions at the time, South Carolina didn't require a 24-hour wait to report a missing person. That saved precious time, and they used it. What followed was one of the largest missing person searches in Lexington County history. Helicopters scanned the area. Bloodhounds combed the woods. A command center was set up near the Smith home, operating 24/7. The governor's emergency division brought in trailers with phones, radios, and advanced equipment to support the effort. From the start, authorities were clear. This was not a runaway. "She's not a runaway," Captain Bob Ford told reporters. "We can't accept that theory." The entire community mobilized. Over 100 volunteers braved 97-degree heat, sweeping 20 square miles on foot. Some collapsed from exhaustion. One man stepped on a nail. A police officer was rushed to the hospital with a spider bite. And then a clue, a red bandana, confirmed to belong to Sherry, was found less than a mile from her home, tossed on the roadside. Investigators believed it had been dropped from a moving car, a desperate signal left behind. But the trail went cold. Case 11. The waiting game. The FBI arrived on the third day, and that was both a relief and a worry, because a ransom note never came. Normally, ransom cases, though terrifying, be a blessing in disguise. They mean communication, and communication means a chance to stall, track, negotiate, ... maybe even save a life. But as the hours turned to days, no message came, no demands, no updates, no clue if Sherry was even alive. By now, authorities were convinced this wasn't just a kidnapping. It was something else, bigger, darker, and far more dangerous than Lexington County could handle alone. That's when the FBI's Columbia Field Office stepped in, and not a moment too soon. Case 12, The Quiet Rise of a Future Killer, Herb Baumeister. On April 7, 1947, in Westfield, Indiana, Herbert Richard Baumeister appeared, by all outward measures, to have a perfectly average life. He was the firstborn of Herbert Sr., a successful anesthesiologist, and Elizabeth, a doting stepmother. By the time Herb was 9, the family had grown to include 3 younger siblings, and with his father's success, they soon moved into a more spacious home in the suburbs. If you asked neighbors or teachers, they'd describe young Herb as polite, quiet, and even funny, though sometimes his humor veered toward the weird. There were no tragic head injuries, no serious illness, no abuse, no trauma. In fact, nothing that could explain what would come next. But by the time Herb reached adolescence, something was shifting. Subtly at first, then grotesquely. He began to show a deep fascination with death. What started as off-color jokes evolved into something much more unsettling. He developed a hobby observing roadkill. One day, he came across the corpse of a small crow. Its body was stiff with rigor mortis, flies buzzing like a veil over it. But Herb wasn't disgusted. He was entranced as he picked the carcass up. Its decaying body gave off a stench that, to him, was intoxicating. When he pressed into the bird's side, it twitched it not from life, but from something far worse. Maggots. They crawled under its skin, writhing like a second pulse. Herb popped one between his fingers, watched its contents ooze out, and let the sensation wash over him. Something about it stirred a new kind of thrill, one that settled not just in his mind, but in his body. At that moment, he was interrupted. A childhood friend, Bill Donovan, called out to him. Herb snapped out of his trance, but not before hatching a new plan. Something that would make the other boys laugh. Something he would find funny. No one would forget it, and no one, not even his own family, would ever really understand what was beginning to grow inside him. Case 13. The Making of Belle, Gunnestadt's Black Widow. She was born Brynhild Paulstatter Sturseth, sometime around November 11th, between 1855 and 1859. Her village, in Bygda, nestled in the cold hills of Selbu, Norway, was remote, bleak, and poor. Her father, Paul Peterson Sturseth, was a stonemason and sharecropper. Her mother, Berit, stayed home with the children, 8 in total. Brynhild was the youngest, and arguably the toughest. The Sturseths lived in a cramped wooden cottage, scraping by on the bare minimum. Every member of the family worked. Paul labored during winter months, and his children gathered whatever they could. Brynhild's job: firewood, twigs, leaves. She wandered the forests alone, scooping up scraps to warm the cottage at night. Locals teased her, calling her Snurk Visbula, Paul's twig daughter. The nickname stuck, along with the sting of poverty and the cold that never quite left her bones. At just 14 years old, Brynhild went to work as a dairymaid. Her days were spent herding cattle, milking, and scrubbing, always scrubbing. No rigid class structure left little hope for girls like her. The best she could hope for was survival. But Brynhild had other plans, dreams of wealth, of power, of rising above the sneers and rags of her childhood, dreams that would eventually bring her to America and turn her into one of history's most prolific killers. Case 13. Belle Gunnes, from broken girl to butcher of Menin, the rugged hills of rural Selbu, Norway. Brynhild Paulstatter Sturseth came into the world under the shadow of struggle. Born sometime between 1855 and 1859, the youngest of 8 children in a family barely surviving on a single acre of farmland. Her early life was marked by scarcity and shame. Her father, Paul, worked year-round farming in summer and stone masonry in winter, but even that wasn't enough. The Sturseth family hovered just above starvation, and more than once had to accept welfare. By the time Brynhild turned 18, things had only worsened. She had grown up doing every chore imaginable, herding cows, churning butter, milking, hauling twigs from the forest just to keep a fire going. And all around her, the harsh world reminded her of one thing: money mattered more than anything. A lesson that hardened into obsession, one that would drive her actions for the rest of her life, to some. Brynhild was a model of virtue, a diligent worker, a faithful Christian, someone well-versed in her prayers. Her pastor at the Evangelical Lutheran Church sang her praises. So did her employers. But to others in Cebu, she was something altogether different. Years later, when the truth of her crimes came to light, the Selbagon newspaper published a scathing remembrance. She was remembered by many as a capricious, malicious girl. She lied, pulled cruel tricks, and never spoke much. Even as a child, people thought she was rotten. Perhaps it was hindsight, or perhaps it was earned. A pivotal shift came around 1877, when Brynhild, then 17, reportedly became pregnant. The father, as gossip told it, may have been the son of a wealthy landowner, possibly even the man who owned the land her family farmed. It was a scandal, not only because she was unmarried, but because she was poor, socially insignificant, and, according to many, plain-faced at best photos from her youth show, a stern, heavy-featured woman with deep-set eyes and a large jaw. One true crime author would later describe her as a notably homely woman, with a wide frog-like mouth. Whatever the man had once seen in her, it wasn't enough. He wanted nothing to do with the child or with Brynhild. And then came the night of the country dance. It's said she encountered the man again and something happened, an assault, violent, so brutal that it caused a miscarriage. Afterward, those closest to her noticed something had changed. Brynhild became colder, more calculating, and full of rage. Not long after, the man who had assaulted her was dead. Because it was a sudden, excruciating illness that bore a striking resemblance to arsenic, poisoning. Whether it was an act of revenge or just the beginning of a new pattern is still debated, but one thing's certain: the naive farm girl died that night, too. And what remained was Belle Gunnis, a woman who would leave Norway, move to America, and become one of the most prolific and terrifying female killers in recorded history. Case 14. Dr. Death. Harold Shipman Hay was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England, just months after the end of World War II, a baby of the post-war boom, born into hope and rebuilding. His parents, Harold and Vera Shipman, were working class and proud. They had 3 children, but it was Harold, the middle child, who stood out. Even from a young age, he was seen as special, intelligent, driven, destined for great things, at least. That's what his mother made him believe. And Vera, she was no ordinary mother. She was strict, fiercely proud, and emotionally tethered to her son. She controlled every detail of his life, from his school clothes to who he was allowed to speak to. And Harold, he worshipped her, while his father stayed in the background. Vera was the sun around which Harold orbited. Their bond grew unnervingly strong over the years. She demanded perfection, and Harold worked tirelessly to give it to her. Inside the Shipman home, everything was spotless, structured, controlled. But the outside world found them odd. Neighbors noted how the Shipman children never played outside, never joined in with other kids on the estate. Hannah Cutler, who lived across the street at the time, remembered. They were quiet. They kept to themselves. When they came home from school, they didn't go back out. They just stayed in. 2 outsiders. It looked like discipline, but behind closed doors, a strange detachment was forming. A life shaped entirely by control, image, and isolation. By the time Harold reached adolescence, the foundation was laid for something chilling. He was brilliant, yes, but also entitled. In his mind, he was superior, destined for more, and, ultimately, deserving of control over life and death itself. It would take years before the world would realize just how far he was willing to go to keep that control, before anyone suspected that Dr. Harold Shipman, respected GP, quiet family man, was one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history, with over 200 victims silently lost under his care. Part 1. The Boy in the Bodie. Harold Shipman, they called him Frida, nickname given to Harold Shipman by his peers in Nottingham, England. Even as a child, he stood out not just because he was smart, but because he seemed different. His mother Vera made sure of it, while other kids wore casual clothes to play outside. Harold was made to dress like a miniature gentleman Westcott, Bodie, the works. Vera wasn't just a homemaker, she was a sculptor of her children's futures, especially her middle child. She believed Harold was destined for greatness, and she poured everything into making sure he lived up to that idea. Harold's childhood wasn't devoid of warmth. He was close to his siblings, particularly Pauline. His older sister Anne even formed a long-lasting friendship with a boy named Alan Goddard, who lived just a few doors down. The two met as toddlers, attending Beaufort Infant School, and stayed friends through the years. But as he grew older, Harold developed a streak of arrogance, likely inherited from his mother's rigid standards. At school, he was bright, athletic, and competitive football, rugby, even stoolball, an obscure sport native to the region. He was good, but he wasn't well liked. Teachers described him as a loner, intense, and distant, even among peers. Harold Shipman was already an island. In 1957, he achieved what Vera had long dreamed of: acceptance into High Pavement Grammar School, a prestigious boys' school in the area. But that triumph quickly soured. For the first time, Harold was no longer exceptional. At High Pavement, he was surrounded by other top-performing boys, and he struggled with feeling average. The foundation of a killer doesn't always form in a broken home. Shipman's story defies the pattern. No childhood abuse, no brain trauma, no diagnosed mental illness. His life was painfully ordinary, until everything changed. At just 17 years old, Harold's world turned upside down when Vera was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. As her condition deteriorated, Harold became her caretaker. He would come straight home from school, spend afternoons by her bedside, bring her tea, and wait with her for the doctor's visits. It was during these visits that young Harold first encountered morphine. He watched as the doctor administered the injections, saw how his mother, once frail and gasping in agony, would become calm, lucid, almost herself again. He was mesmerized. The transformation was near instantaneous, but the end came quickly. On June 21st, 1963, Vera Shipman died at just 43 years old. Her family mourned in typical fashion. Harold, he ran through the rain all weekend, alone, pushing his body to exhaustion. By Monday, he was back at school. When a classmate asked what he did over the weekend, he replied bluntly, "My mom died. No one even knew she had been sick." Her death marked a turning point. Until then, Harold had shown no desire to become a doctor, but something clicked. He now wanted to be the one holding the syringe, the one bringing relief, or power, or both. He would go on to become one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history, murdering over 200 patients using that same morphine he once watched ease his mother's pain. But that's a story for another episode. Part 2. The Girl Who Disappeared. Chelsea Porman. Her name was Chelsea Porman, born in 1995 in Regina, Saskatchewan, and raised amid struggle, but also resilience. Chelsea was a proud member of the Kawakatus First Nation, one of 3 daughters raised by Sheila Porman, a woman who herself battled addiction and cancer while fighting to reunite her family. Chelsea's early years were far from easy. Foster care, uncertainty, and instability defined much of her childhood. But despite it all, she never lost her kindness. She was the sort of person who would hand out hot coffee to the homeless in the dead of winter. who dreamed of working in cosmetology and fashion design, and who loved animals and the earth in equal measure. In 2014, Chelsea graduated from Bishop Murray High School, earning a Perseverance Award for overcoming her challenges, but her journey was far from over. Just months after graduation, she was hit by a truck while walking home. The accident nearly killed her. She suffered a traumatic brain injury, a fractured skull, a disabled arm, and 2 severely broken legs. Doctors weren't sure she would ever walk again, but Chelsea refused to give up. With the help of braces and sheer determination, she taught herself to walk again, even with a lifted shoe and permanent damage. By 2020, Chelsea had moved to Vancouver. It was a fresh start, closer to family, better access to mental health, resources, and a chance to rebuild. On September 6th, during Labor Day weekend, Chelsea went out for dinner with her sister Paige. They laughed, drank, and made their way to a party near Davie and Granville Streets. But sometime that night, the sisters got into a minor argument, and Chelsea walked off alone. At 12:57 a.m., she texted her sister, "I met a new bae, I'm going to meet him." And then, silence, no activity, no sightings, no calls, nothing. When the family reported her missing on September 8th, they expected urgency. Instead, they were met with indifference. It took the Vancouver Police Department 10 days to issue a public notice about her disappearance, even though her family made it clear she was vulnerable, both physically and mentally. Weeks passed. Then, months. Eventually, the VPD transferred the case to the homicide unit, stating they now had the resources to investigate further, but Chelsea's family no longer trusted them. They took matters into their own hands, organizing rallies, posting flyers, raising reward money, and begging for public help, but no leads came. Then, on April 22, 2022, over a year and a half later, a construction worker made a gruesome discovery. Human remains, found in the overgrown backyard of a $7.1 million abandoned mansion in Vancouver's Shaughnessy neighborhood, one of the city's wealthiest enclaves. It was Chelsea. How she ended up there, who she was with, and what exactly happened that night remains a mystery. The police have not labeled her death a homicide, despite clear signs that she did not end up there by accident. Her family continues to fight for answers. Closing thoughts. 2 ends of the same silence. One was a doctor, quietly taking lives behind a mask of compassion. The other, a vulnerable woman, forgotten in the silence of a city that moved on without her. Harold Shipman killed hundreds and no one noticed for decades. Chelsea Porman vanished in a matter of hours and no one listened for days. Sometimes, silence is the real killer. Segment 1. The girl on the patio. Chelsea Porman had already survived so much. Chelsea Porman, born in 1995, and a member of the Kawakatus First Nation, had a childhood marked by turbulence and resilience. Placed in foster care while her mother battled cancer and addiction, Chelsea eventually reunited with her family in her teen years. She was quiet, kind-hearted, and had a passion for fashion, the environment, and helping others, often bringing warm coffee to those living on the streets during harsh Saskatchewan winters. In 2014, Chelsea graduated from high school in Saskatoon, receiving a Perseverance Award. A few months later, her life changed forever when she was hit by a truck while walking home. The accident left her with a traumatic brain injury, fractured skull, a permanently damaged arm, and metal rods in both legs. Doctors weren't sure she'd walk again, but Chelsea proved them wrong. She fought her way back, learning to walk with a brace and lifted shoe. By 2020, Chelsea moved to Vancouver in search of a fresh start and better access to mental health services. That September, she went out with her sister during the Labor Day weekend, visiting bars and eventually a house party downtown. But after a minor disagreement with her sister, Chelsea walked off alone, intoxicated and vulnerable. At 12:57 a.m., she sent a text, "I met a new bae, I'm going to meet him. It was the last anyone would hear from her. When her family reported her missing on September 8th, they expected urgency from police. But the Vancouver Police Department waited 10 days before releasing a public notice. Her mother, Sheila, was stunned. She had made it clear Chelsea had physical disabilities, mental health challenges, and was at risk. Months passed, no suspects, no leads. So her family took action, printing flyers, organizing rallies, offering a $10,000 reward. But there was only silence. Then, on April 22nd, 2022, nearly 2 years after her disappearance, a construction worker discovered human remains in the overgrown backyard of a $7.1 million mansion in Shaughnessy, one of Vancouver's most affluent neighborhoods. It was Chelsea. Yet police waited 2 weeks to inform her family, saying they needed to confirm the identity, a claim her family disputes. The body matched Chelsea's clothes and known physical traits, including her leg braces. Worse still, the coroner's findings were troubling. Chelsea was missing several fingers and parts of her skull. Her phone was missing, later traced at Victory Square, miles away. She had no ID. Her body was found lying just outside a back door, visible from the patio end, yet somehow, it had gone unnoticed for over a year. Police claim Chelsea likely died the night she went missing. Her family doesn't believe that. How could a young woman with limited mobility walk nearly 6 kilometers to the mansion without being seen? Why wasn't her body discovered sooner? And why did her father, Mike Kieran, find her belongings still at the scene when he broke into the mansion himself? Items police had failed to collect. The case remains open, but not classified as suspicious. The family disagrees. In their eyes, Chelsea's case isn't just a tragedy, it's a failure of justice. Segment 2. The girl who promised to return. Alicia Navarro. She was brilliant, introverted, shy. Alicia Navarro loved video games like Minecraft and Roblox, preferred hoodies even in the Arizona heat, and had a weakness for McDonald's chicken nuggets. Diagnosed with high-functioning autism, she often found comfort in the online world, a place where her intelligence could shine and she could connect safely. In the early hours of September 15, 2019, just days before her 15th birthday, Alicia walked downstairs to get a glass of water. Her mom, Jessica, wasn't alarmed. It was normal for Alicia to stay up late, gaming. But the next morning, Alicia was gone. Jessica discovered the back door slightly ajar, several chairs stacked against the backyard wall, and a chilling handwritten note. I ran away. I will be back. I swear. I'm sorry. Her laptop was missing, but not the charger. Police searched the home and the neighborhood. Alicia's birthday came and went with no contact. Her social media accounts went dark. Jessica became convinced that someone had lured Alicia online, a predator posing as a friend or romantic partner. Tips trickled in. One woman reported seeing a girl resembling Alicia holding hands with a man just 10 minutes from the family's home. Another said she saw the same girl days later. Neither lead panned out. As time passed, the case gained attention. The FBI and Center for Missing and Exploited Children got involved. An age-progressed photo was released, but Alicia remained missing. Then, nearly 4 years later, in July 2023, Alicia walked into a police station in Havre, Montana, just 40 miles from the Canadian border. She told officers she wanted to be removed from the missing persons list. She was 18 years old. By all accounts, she was healthy, safe, and happy. She said she had left voluntarily. The public breathed a sigh of relief, but her story wasn't over. On October 24, 2023, police arrested Edmund Eddie Davis, a man they described as Alicia's boyfriend, on charges of child sexual abuse. They discovered explicit material involving Alicia on his phone during a search of his apartment at the time of her disappearance. Alicia had been just 14 years old. The charges against Davis, for now, are not directly related to Alicia's disappearance, but questions remain. Who convinced Alicia to leave? How long had she been with Davis? And was she ever truly free? The public may never know all the details, but one thing is clear. Alicia didn't just run away. She was taken. Segment 3. A death to meet Lavina Johnson. Her name was Lavina Johnson, but her family called her Leave. Born and raised in Florissant, Missouri, she was a proud daughter of a military family, and followed in her father's footsteps by enlisting in the U.S. Army. Deployed to Balad, Iraq, Lavina worked in communications and frequently wrote letters home. She had plans to come home for Christmas, to decorate the tree, to be with her siblings. On July 17, 2005, Lavina spoke to her family on the phone. She was cheerful, excited, and told them she'd be home early. A few days later, a soldier knocked on the Johnsons' door. Lavina was dead. The Army claimed she had taken her own life. They said she was distraught over a 2-month relationship that ended and had burned love letters before turning an M16 rifle on herself, shooting herself in the mouth. The Johnsons were devastated and confused. None of it made sense. They had just spoken to her. She was happy. She was planning the future. Then came the funeral. The Army recommended a closed casket, but the Johnsons chose otherwise, and what they saw chilled them. Lavina had a broken nose, cut lips, and a bullet wound on the side of her head, not through her mouth, as the Army claimed. The wound was small, consistent with a 9mm round, not an M16. Her gloves had been glued onto her hands, which made no sense. And when her father, Dr. John Johnson, finally accessed the autopsy report, he found even more disturbing details. There was no rape kit, no proper forensic work, no justice. The family has spent nearly 2 decades fighting for the truth. To them, it's obvious Lavina didn't commit suicide. She was silenced. Closing thoughts. Chelsea Porman, Alicia Navarro, Lavina Johnson. 3 women, 3 tragedies, 3 cases shaped by indifference, disbelief, and institutional neglect. Some disappeared into the night. Others never left the room. What binds them all is not just how they were failed, but how they refused to be forgotten, and neither will we. Segment 4. The cover-up. Lavina Johnson, for Private First Class. Lavina Johnson. Joining the U.S. Army was more than service, it was legacy. The daughter of Dr. John Johnson, a military veteran himself, Lavina was raised in Florissant, Missouri, surrounded by 4 siblings and the values of hard work, discipline, and pride. She dreamed of following her father's path. Stationed in Balad, Iraq, Lavina worked in communications. Despite the challenges of war, she remained in close contact with her family, writing home frequently. On July 17th, she called her parents with a heartwarming update. She'd be home for Christmas. Days later, the doorbell rang. A soldier arrived to deliver the unthinkable news. Lavina was dead. The Army's account was swift and chilling. According to their report, Lavina had become distraught after a brief breakup, burned some letters from her boyfriend, and shot herself in the mouth with an M16 rifle. They even recommended a closed casket funeral, but her family said none of it made sense. They had just spoken to her. She was excited to come home. She was happy. Against military advice, the Johnsons chose an open casket, and what they saw shattered any remaining trust. Lavina's nose appeared broken, her lips were cut, and a single bullet hole was visible, not in her mouth, but on the left side of her head. Her gloves had been glued to her hands, an act far from standard protocol. The injuries looked more like the aftermath of an assault than a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The Army said they didn't perform a rape kit because there were no signs of struggle. There was no suicide note, no bullet recovered, no gunshot residue on her hands, and a trail of blood led outside the tent where her body was found. Still, the Army closed the case. Lavina's father wasn't done. He hired a private investigator and spent months fighting for access to original case files. When they finally arrived, So did the truth. Color crime scene photographs showed Lavina's face beaten, her eye blackened, her teeth loosened. There was evidence of blunt force trauma, and most disturbingly, signs that a corrosive liquid had been poured into her. Genitals likely to destroy DNA evidence. Dr. Johnson also doubted the physical logistics. How could his 5'1" daughter position an M16 rifle between her legs and pull the trigger? To him, it was obvious this was no suicide. This was a staged crime scene, designed to protect someone with rank, power, and connections. Sadly, the Johnsons are not alone. Across the country, families of women in the military have faced similar battles cases written off as suicides, where the evidence tells another story entirely. Their fight continues, not just for Lavina, but for every daughter in uniform who deserves truth, transparency, and justice. Segment 5. The Girl in the Storm. Asha DeGrin, February 13, 2000. Asha DeGrin, a shy and soft-spoken 9-year-old girl, went to bed in her Shelby, North Carolina home. Her family mother Aquila, father Howard, and 10-year-old brother O'Brien had their routines disrupted by a power outage caused by a car accident nearby. They postponed the children's bath until morning. At 8:30 p.m., the kids went to bed. At 12:30 a.m., the power came back, and Howard returned from work. He checked on the kids. They were fast asleep. At 2:30 a.m., he checked once more, still sleeping. But O'Brien later recalled something strange. At some point during the night, he awoke and saw Asha standing in their room. He assumed she was going to the bathroom. He went back to sleep. By 5:30 a.m., Aquila's alarm went off. She went to wake the kids. Asha was gone. The family searched the house, the yard, called neighbors. Nothing. Soon after, the police arrived. No signs of forced entry. No foul play. But Asha's backpack, sneakers, and 2 outfits were missing. Police believed she'd left on her own. Her parents disagreed. Asha was afraid of storms, the dark, and dogs. And that night, it was raining hard. A recent loss at a basketball game had upset her, but her parents insisted she was not the type to run away. Then, eyewitness reports began coming in, between 3:45 and 4:15 a.m. Both a truck driver and a motorist spotted a girl matching Asha's description walking along Highway 18, wearing a long-sleeved white shirt and white pants, clothes missing from her closet. One driver turned around to check on her, but when he approached, she panicked and ran into the woods. On February 15th, just 2 days later, a woman found a Mickey Mouse hairbow, a green marker, and a pencil in a nearby shed. Candy wrappers found their matched ones. Asha had received during a basketball tournament that same weekend, but then silence. It wasn't until August 2001, nearly 18 months later, that the most chilling clue emerged. A contractor digging on his property 26 miles away, in the opposite direction from where she'd been seen, walking earthed a black trash bag. Inside was another bag. Inside that, a child's backpack with Asha's name and phone number written on it. The location raised serious questions. Investigators also found a pair of men's khaki pants, but DNA results were never publicly released. In 2016, a new witness came forward, claiming to have seen Asha getting into a dark green 1970s Ford Thunderbird, or Lincoln, Continental Mark IV on the night she vanished, in 2018. Investigators made a public plea for 2 critical items: a Dr. Seuss book, McElligot's Pool, borrowed from her school library, a New Kids on the Block concert T-shirt. Then, a breakthrough on September 16, 2024. Details from several search warrants were unsealed. A family in the Charlotte area, the Deadman family, came under suspicion. They had lived in Cleveland County at the time Asha went missing. According to the warrant, DNA from the Deadman family's daughter was found on Asha's belongings. Police searched multiple properties, including homes owned by Roy Deadman, the family patriarch. One of those homes was just 3.7 miles from where Asha was last seen. Among the items seized, computers, cameras, and SD cards, clothing, gay, smartwatch, and at least one green car. Whether it's the same vehicle seen in 2000 remains unknown, but for the first time in over 2 decades, investigators may be closing in on what really happened to Asha Degree. Closing reflection. Lavina Johnson. Asha Degree. 2 young women from very different worlds, one a soldier, one a schoolgirl, yet both surrounded by silence, secrets, and suspicion. In Lavina's case, justice was denied in uniform. In Asha's, innocence vanished into the dark. But their stories are not forgotten, because where official reports falter, memory persists. And when families are forced to fight alone, we listen. We whisper these names not just in memory, but in defiance, so the truth can echo louder than any cover-up, any closed file, any lie. Episode 15, Part 3, Buried Truths and Broken Trust. Segment 6. The Smell of Lavender. Ana Basaldua Ruiz. Ana Basaldua Ruiz grew up in the quiet state of Michoacán, Mexico, surrounded by books, flowers, and music. Even as a child, Ana was known for her neatness and discipline. She loved dancing, adored the scent of lavender, and spent hours lost in the words of her favorite author, Paulo Coelho. In 2020, Ana became a naturalized U.S. citizen through her father, Ubaldo Basaldua, who lived in Long Beach, California, filled with purpose and eager to make something of herself. Ana made a bold decision. She joined the U.S. Army. After a year-long delay due to the pandemic, Ana finally began her training in July 2021. Once completed, she was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, as a combat engineer with the 91st Engineer Battalion. But Ana's time in the military was far from what she had hoped. According to her mother, Alejandra Ruiz, and close friends, Ana endured continuous sexual harassment. She confided in people she trusted, saying things like, "Mom, everyone wants me to sleep with them, but they're all assholes." Despite her growing discomfort, Ana stayed focused on finishing her contract. She had just a few more months before she could finally leave Fort Hood. Then, in March 2023, everything changed. On Saturday, March 11th, Ana called her father. She was exhausted, both mentally and physically. She told him she felt broken, like her entire life was wrong. She even mentioned wanting to die. It was the last time he ever heard her voice. The next morning, Ubaldo texted her. No response. On Monday, March 13th, his texts began bouncing. Concerned, he checked her phone's satellite location. It pinged inside a park on base. That same morning, military officials arrived at his workplace. Ana's body had been found in a maintenance bay on the base. The cause of death, suspected suicide. But for Ubaldo and Alejandra, that explanation made no sense. Ana had just told her father she was planning to finish her service. She may have been overwhelmed, but she had a plan. She was counting down the days to freedom. On March 17th, Army investigators stated they found no signs of foul play, but that an internal investigation was ongoing. Ana's mother applied for a humanitarian visa to travel to the U.S. to demand answers about her daughter's final moments. But, tragically, Ana's story is not unique. Fort Hood has become synonymous with systemic neglect. In 2020 alone, the base recorded 23 deaths, including the shocking murder of Vanessa Gillen, another soldier who had also reported sexual harassment. A federal review of Fort Hood found that sexual assault cases were significantly underreported and often ignored, with enlisted soldiers afraid of retaliation. Ana's story fits that disturbing pattern. She should have come home. She should have danced again. She should have smelled lavender in peace. But now, her voice joins the chorus of others silenced within the very institution sworn to protect them. Segment 7, Runaway or Cover-Up. Alyssa Turnian, May 2001. Alyssa Turney was 17 years old high school junior, in Phoenix, Arizona, living with her younger stepsister Sarah and their stepfather Michael Turney. Their mother had passed away, and Michael, a former police officer, had taken over raising the girls. Sarah and Alyssa had very different relationships with him. To Sarah, he was the cool dad, laid back, supportive, but to Alyssa, he was controlling, restrictive, and constantly monitored her every move. On May 17th, the last day of school before summer break, Sarah was away at a school retreat. Michael failed to pick her up on time. When he finally arrived, he told her that Alyssa was missing. On the ride home, Sarah tried calling Alyssa, no answer. When they returned, Michael had her check Alyssa's room. There, on the bed, were the contents of Alyssa's backpack, dumped out. Her cell phone was left behind, sitting next to a note. Dad and Sarah, when you dropped me off at school today, I decided I really am going to California. Sarah, you said you really wanted me gone. Now you have it. Dad, I took $300. That's why I've been saving. It seemed like Alyssa had run away. After all, she had mentioned wanting to go live with an aunt in California. So when Michael called the police that night to report her missing, he told them she was a runaway and knew where she was headed. No investigation followed. A week later, Michael claimed he got a call from Alyssa early in the morning, around 4:30 a.m., according to him. She told him she was in Riverside, California, was unhappy, and blamed him for her leaving. There was no way to verify this call. Michael said his home surveillance system wasn't recording at that time. Years passed. No one heard from Alyssa again. She never contacted friends, never reached out to the aunt, never touched the $1,800 in her bank account. Her social security number was never used. In 2006, police received a letter from a Florida inmate claiming he had killed Alyssa. It turned out to be a hoax, but the investigation sparked renewed interest in Michael Turney. Why did Alyssa vanish under his watch? Why was there no investigation? Police learned that Michael had dozens of security cameras around his home, had been secretly recording his own daughters for years. He also had an obsession with Alyssa's safety, constantly calling her, tracking her movements, and even forcing her to sign bizarre contracts about her behavior. Then came the most chilling discovery. In 2008, police raided Michael's house. Inside, they found 26 homemade explosive devices, multiple assault weapons, over 1,000 rounds of ammunition, and a detailed manifesto titled "The Diary of a Madman in the Diary." Michael accused the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers of orchestrating Alyssa's disappearance. He had once been in conflict with the union. The theory made no logical sense, but it hinted at a deeply unstable mind. Still, no charges related to Alyssa's disappearance were filed until 2020, after years of relentless advocacy from her sister Sarah, who had become a full-time activist and podcaster on her sister's case. Michael Turney was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. But in July 2023, a judge dismissed the charges, citing insufficient evidence. Today, Michael Turney walks free. Alyssa Turney remains missing, and Sarah continues the fight. Because if it wasn't a runaway, and it wasn't a hoax, then who's protecting the truth? Closing reflection from Anna to Alyssa. We see again how institutions, whether military or domestic, can fail the vulnerable, dismiss the warning signs, and bury the truth beneath convenient stories. But when families refuse to be silent, when survivors push back, when the missing are remembered, the truth has a way of resurfacing. So we whispered their names: Anna Basaldua, Alyssa Turney, not in mourning, but in defiance, until every file is opened, every lie dismantled, and every soul accounted for. Episode 15, Part 4. The Missing, the Silenced. The Watch, Segment 8. The Hidden Tapes. Alyssa Turney conclusion. As police dug deeper into Alyssa Turney's case, one thing became crystal clear: this was not a runaway. In fact, investigators learned that Alyssa hadn't been at school the entire day she supposedly left for California. Witnesses confirmed that, around lunchtime, Michael Turney picked her up, something verified by her boyfriend, John, who recalled Alyssa telling him she was leaving early but planned to see him that night at a party. Friends said the same thing. Alyssa had made plans for later. She wasn't leaving for good. Michael, however, told a different story. He claimed he and Alyssa had gone out for lunch, only to return home and get into an argument about house rules. After that, she allegedly stormed off to her room, and he left to run errands. That's where his version of the story ends. Police began to understand just how paranoid and controlling Michael Turney really was. He kept meticulous records, documenting every single call that entered or left their home. He had multiple surveillance cameras mounted around the house, including a hidden one inside a living room air vent. When asked to turn over the tapes, from the day Alyssa vanished, Michael said he had already reviewed the footage and there was nothing important to see. As for the audio recordings, he claimed the recorder had been shut off that day. Investigators now had enough to secure a search warrant for the home. What they found was terrifying. Inside the house were 26 homemade pipe bombs, detailed blueprints, and a 90-page handwritten manifesto. In it, Michael claimed Alyssa had run away and was later murdered by two men from the electrical union he had once worked for. He believed they were taking revenge for his whistleblowing. Even more disturbing, he claimed he had already avenged her death by killing those same men. But those men, they had died of natural causes. There was no evidence linking them to Alyssa or to any violence at all. Among the massive trove of documents, investigators found letters allegedly written by Alyssa, accusing her stepfather of molestation, parent-child contracts where Alyssa was coerced into denying abuse, testimonies from friends, and even a teacher who had heard Alyssa's abuse allegations. One friend who said Alyssa confessed Michael once picked her up early from school, drove her to a secluded area, and tried to assault her. Another friend recalled Alyssa waking up to Michael trying to gag her with a sock. Michael denied everything. He was arrested in 2008 and not for Alyssa's disappearance, but for the pipe bombs. He later pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. During that time, he was diagnosed with paranoid personality disorder and required to undergo mental health treatment. But the fight for justice didn't end there. Fueled by grief and determination, Alyssa's stepsister Sarah Turney launched a podcast called Voices for Justice, bringing new national attention to her sister's case. In June 2020, she announced that police had submitted the case to the prosecutor. Then, finally on August 21, 2020, Michael Turney was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. It seemed like closure was finally within reach, but on July 20th, 2023, the unthinkable happened. After just 5 days of testimony, the court dismissed all charges under Rule 20 of Arizona's criminal procedure, citing insufficient evidence for the case to proceed to a jury. Michael Turney walked free. Alyssa remained missing, and Sarah Turney, she's still speaking out, still searching, still whispering the truth, until someone finally listens. Segment 9. Down the Hill, Abby Williams and Libby German. Monday, February 13th, 2017, was supposed to be just another day off from school. In the small town of Delphi, Indiana, two best friends, Abigail Abby Williams, 13, and Liberty Libby German, 14, decided to spend the day exploring the Manon High Bridge Trail, a popular hiking spot and historical site. They were dropped off around 1 p.m., and Libby's father planned to pick them up a few hours later, at 2:07 p.m. Libby posted a photo to Snapchat of Abby mid-stride, walking along the old train bridge. That would be the last known image of them alive. When Libby's father arrived at 3:30 p.m., there was no sign of the girls. He called them, no answer. He walked the trail himself. Still nothing. By 5:30 p.m., the families called police. By sunset, a full search was underway. That night, Libby's phone went dark. The next morning, the search resumed, this time with canines, divers, and the FBI. At around noon, a volunteer searcher discovered 2 bodies near Deer Creek, just half a mile from where Libby had taken the Snapchat. The girls were gone. The cause of death was never released publicly, but what came next would shock even seasoned investigators. Police revealed that Libby had recorded the suspect both a photo and an audio clip on her phone. In the image, a man in jeans and a hoodie walks across the bridge toward the girls, and in the audio clip, a voice can be heard saying just 3 chilling words: "Down the hill." Libby, it seemed, had sensed something was wrong and took action. She captured her killer, but for years, his identity remained a mystery. Dozens of names surfaced. One was Daniel Nations, arrested in Colorado for brandishing a hatchet and threatening hikers. Another was Charles Eldridge, who tried to solicit a minor online, and John Miller, convicted of killing April Tinsley in a separate cold case. None of them matched. None of them fit. Then, in 2019, police held a press conference that changed everything. They revealed a new suspect sketch this time, a man between 18 and 40 years old. He was believed to be from Delphi, or someone who frequented the area. More than 2 years later, on October 28, 2022, authorities made an arrest. Richard Allen, a 50-year-old Delphi resident and CVS worker, was charged with 2 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of Abby and Libby. Allen had never moved. He had lived less than 2 miles from the trail. He had been interviewed once in 2017, shortly after the murders, and told police he'd been on the bridge that day. They never followed up until new evidence emerged. Now behind bars, Richard Allen awaits trial. The audio, the photo, the sketch, all allegedly point to him. And yet, after all this time, the community still wonders why. What happened down that hill? 2 young girls went out for a walk on a sunny day and left behind the evidence that may finally bring them justice. Closing notes, whether it's a sister fighting for justice or a teenager capturing her killer on a smartphone, these cases remind us of the power of one voice, one choice, one moment. Sometimes, all it takes is a whisper to echo through the silence. Episode 15, Part 5. Shadows in Plain Sight, Segment 10. The Face Behind the Voice, Abby Williams and Libby German, Part 2. As the months passed after the horrific murders of Abby Williams and Libby German, a trickle of evidence gave way to something bigger, something chilling. Police released a longer version of the suspect's audio clip. The now infamous voice, captured on Libby's phone, was clearer this time. You can hear the man calmly commanding, "Guys, down the hill." 3 seconds. That's all it took to send shivers down the nation's spine. But investigators weren't finished. They issued a public appeal. They were searching for the owner of a vehicle that had been abandoned on February 14, 2017, between noon and 5 o'clock p.m. near the old CPS, DCS, welfare building on County Road 300 North. Then, in a press conference unlike any before, one investigator stepped up to the mic and spoke directly to the killer. "We believe you are hiding in plain sight. For over 2 years, you thought we wouldn't shift our strategy, but we did. We've likely spoken to you, or someone close to you. We know this is about power for you. You want to know what we know. One day, you will." That day was getting closer. In April 2021, authorities arrested 42-year-old James Chadwell in nearby Lafayette, Indiana, just 20 miles from Delphi for the brutal kidnapping and attempted murder of a 10-year-old girl. Chadwell had locked her in his basement, though police considered him a potential suspect in Abby and Libby's case. No charges were filed. Then came a disturbing new development. On December 7, 2021, investigators announced they had uncovered a fictitious online profile under the username Anthony_Shots. It was active on Snapchat, Instagram, and other platforms from 2016 to 2017. The profile used stolen images of a male model to lure young girls, soliciting explicit photos, personal addresses, and even arranging in-person meetings. One of those potential targets, Libby German. Still, no arrest. No definitive breakthrough. Until October 31st, 2022. In a move that shook the town of Delphi to its core, police announced the arrest of 50-year-old Richard Alana, CVS employee, lifelong local, and regular visitor to the Manon High Bridge. He had lived quietly in Delphi. He had been interviewed in 2017, just days after the murders, and claimed to be on the trail that day. For 5 years, he'd blended into the community. For 5 years, he had watched and waited. Richard Allen pleaded not guilty and was held without bond. His trial date was set for January, but on November 11th, 2024, the courtroom echoed with the weight of justice. After a 4-week trial, Allen was found guilty on 4 counts of murder and sentenced to 130 years in prison. According to prosecutors, he had encountered the girls on the trail, forced them down the hill at gunpoint, and then cut their throats. Witnesses placed him at the scene. An unspent bullet found near the bodies matched a firearm Allen owned, and Allen had even confessed first to police, then, disturbingly, to his wife. Libby had left the world a digital trail, and finally, someone followed it. Segment 11. No one just vanishes. The disappearance of Akia Eggleston, May 3rd, 2017, was just another spring day in Baltimore, Maryland. Hell, it wasn't. 22-year-old Akia 8 months pregnant and under strict medical advice to stay on bed rest, was seen leaving her home in Cherry Hill. A family friend had driven her to a nearby bank in Inner Harbor, where she withdrew $572, believed to be a deposit for a new apartment she was going to share with the father of her unborn child. That was the last time anyone saw her. 4 days later, on May 7th, a baby shower and gender reveal party was planned. Akia had spent months organizing it. She was excited, vibrant, ready to celebrate, but she never showed up. Worried friends visited her apartment. She wasn't there. The next day, she was reported missing. Something didn't feel right from the start. Akia was a devoted mother to her 2-year-old daughter. She would never leave without explanation. Not without her child. Not without telling anyone. Inside her apartment, there were signs of a hurried move-out: clothes gone, dresser emptied, yet her bed still in place. Given her high-risk pregnancy and physical limitations, her family knew one thing: Akia could not have moved that furniture on her own. Cameras in her complex, conveniently not working. Suspicion turned to Michael Robertson, the father of her unborn child. He was not at the baby shower, never participated in the search, and hadn't reached out to the family. And he had a secret. He was already in a relationship with multiple children. Akia didn't know the full truth. Despite these glaring red flags, Michael was never named a person of interest. Not then. At a candlelight vigil outside Akia's apartment, a family friend found her bank card in the bushes. It was in good condition, and police had missed it during their search, leading many to believe it had been planted later. For years, her family pressed on. No body, no leads, no answers. Then, in February 2022, 5 long years later, justice began to stir. Baltimore police arrested Michael Robertson, charging him with 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Akia and another for her unborn son. Digital breadcrumbs pieced together the story: a volatile argument between Akia and Robertson the night she vanished, cell phone data placing him as the last person with her internet searches about dump sites in Baltimore, complete lack of effort to help in the search or support her family. Still, one devastating fact remains: Akia Eggleston's body has never been found. Robertson awaits trial, but for Akia's family, the nightmare continues. Their daughter, a vibrant soul who loved dance, family, and her unborn child, remains missing. Physically, yet in spirit, She is louder than ever. Closing note: justice isn't always swift. Sometimes it takes a whisper, a Snapchat, a search in the bushes, or a mother who won't stop asking questions. But truth has a way of rising, and even when a voice is stolen, it still echoes.